My formative years were in the days of the hippies, make love, not war, and all that kind of thing. And the whole philosophy was beautifully summed up in a song by Joni Mitchell, Woodstock, where she calls upon the devotees of hippieism, as it were, to try their best to get back to the garden. So it was all love and peace, man, and let's be cool. Let's drop out and find a natural way of being. Of course, it didn't last because it was basically naive and it was unbalanced in its view of the possibilities of human beings. So it's no coincidence that in the early to mid 70s, the whole thing shifted from love and peace man to the revoltingness of punk rock and saying all this hippie stuff's a load of nonsense. Really, we're full of anger and all that sort of thing. It needs to be expressed. So we're going to look in this particular session at the whole idea of the fall of man, the moving, as it were, from the garden to something else, which is pretty unpleasant. Now, a good place to start really in our search is with St. Augustine of Hippo, bishop in North Africa. And he really put together ideas about sin and the fall of man, which the church has been following in one way or another, or reacting to, ever since. And Augustine wanted to show that human sinfulness was not God's fault. You could not lay the blame for what went wrong and the subsequent experience of man at God's feet. Now, it's quite easy to see why he had a very negative idea of human potentiality, because at the time he was a bishop, everything that he found precious and cultural was beginning to fall apart. The Roman Empire was being invaded by Germanic tribes from the north and everything was collapsing. And he saw this as a judgment on humanity. And so he saw human beings as being really basically very sinful. What he wasn't able to come to grips with really, and it's partly to do with the fact that he saw Adam and Eve as two historical characters that actually existed, was why these two, who were after all in a perfect harmonious garden, should be led astray. Well, the answer that most of the church thinkers and Augustine came up with was that, well, basically they took their eye off the ball. Instead of concentrating on God and their relationship with God, they allowed their eyes to stray and they collapsed morally. Now, I think this is such a profound story, the story of the fall, that we need to take it very seriously. But without thinking that Adam and Eve were actual people, we can come to it from a more psychological understanding. But what the story says is that all of us, it's our experience as we grow up, to move away from the original connection and engagement with one another, and we have to find a new way of engaging. Winnicott, who was a very famous psychologist, said of mothers and babies that they really weren't separate. They were physically separate, but they weren't emotionally separate. And I think in many ways that the story of the fall is a mythological way of talking about that original unity and the loss of it. And so what we have in the story of the fall is the death of original unity. They didn't die physically, but they did die in a sense that they were no longer, as it were, a child with everything laid on. And so all of us find ourselves moving away from that, and we're caught between the potential of goodness and the potential of evil, which lies within all of us. And we start to understand that. And that's what gives us what is described in the story as a godlike experience. We know what it is to experience both good and evil. Usually, at least to begin with, we understand good as being that which makes us feel okay, and evil that which makes us frightened or seeks to destroy us. But what we have, I think, in the story is the birth of a moral struggle. We have to struggle with good and evil, not just out there in the world, but good and evil within ourselves. But also there lies deep within us a desire for unity, to return to the garden, as in the song. But unfortunately, it's impossible to do that. In the story, of course, Adam and Eve are chucked out of the garden, and then an angel with a flaming sword stands at the entrance as they can't get back. So I'm sorry, Joni, it's a lovely song, but we're not able to get back to the garden even if we want to. And many people try to get back to the garden by cutting themselves off in one way or another from the harsh realities of what it means to be a moral human being. They do it sometimes through addiction. They can get a kind of sense of unity within themselves through addiction, where they don't have to face what everyday life will throw at them. And so what we have to engage with as human beings is that we have become dislocated from each other and from God, and we're out of paradise. We have to come to terms with the fact that the beauties and unity of Eden can and has been exchanged for the horror of something like Auschwitz. We are capable of appalling atrocities. And the awful thought that haunts me really is that the people that perpetrated these things were not three-headed monsters, but they were people who loved their children and their wives and their country, and in many ways were just like me. Well, you might say they were psychotic people, very disturbed. That might be true of some of them at least, but that kind of psychotic, a dangerous nature lurks within each one of us, and who knows when it might rear its ugly head. So Augustine had a rather dark view of human beings, and I would suggest to you that in one sense he got it right, and that what comes out of all this is not holding up your hands in horror and just giving up, but the hope that a deeper unity is now possible, where we're not childishly given everything, as it were, on a plate, but we can begin to feel guilt and seek forgiveness. Our first forefathers, Adam and Eve, felt shame. Now, shame is something that's pretty negative, really. They hid themselves away because they realised they were naked. Now, that's quite a complex idea, which we haven't got time to go into. But basically, what we're called to do now we're out of the garden isn't to blame others for our own basic faults, which happens in the story, of course. Adam blames Eve, Eve blames the serpent, and so on. But what we can do is move from shame about what we've done or what we think we've done or what we might do to guilt. Now, guilt means that we understand that what we do affects other people negatively. Once we can start to do that, we are beginning to take responsibility for ourselves and we are growing up. Then engagement becomes possible at a whole different level, an engagement with other people, and most important of all, an engagement with God.